David Hunter's UNA's physics professor laughed in his face as David presented his groundbreaking faster-than-light travel equations, sneering, "A human making one of the greatest scientific discoveries in galactic history? Impossible." But David would soon wipe the arrogant smirk off the prof's tentacled face. Getting accepted to the prestigious Galactic Institute of Technology on the UNA's homeworld was already a long shot for a human. At 19, David was the only member of his inferior species to walk the hallowed halls filled with purple-scaled UNAs who looked down on him. But while the UNAs had ruled the galaxy for millennia with their advanced tech, not one of them had managed to crack the holy grail of physics, faster-than-light travel. The UNAs had teased and tortured humans for centuries, raiding Earth, enslaving David's ancestors, bombarding human cities on a whim. Now the slimy bastards wanted to strip mine the whole planet for its resources, wiping out the last free humans. But not if David could help it. He knew his people's only hope was for him to do the impossible and master FTL, so he could fly to Earth and bring the warp drive plans to the human resistance, turning the tables on the UNA scum once and for all. Night after night he solved esoteric equations alone in the lab, exhausted but determined. He would prove the naysayers wrong or die trying. His arrogant classmate Kellar constantly belittled David's efforts, saying, "Humans are just dumb apes good for slave labor." Well, soon Keeler and the whole galaxy were in for a shock, courtesy of one pissed-off human genius with a score to settle. David's heart raced as he accessed the lab's security camera footage, scanning through the recordings from the fateful night of his breakthrough. His exhausted eyes darted across the screen, desperate for any glimpse of himself working on the equations. But as he reached the crucial time frame, he stared in disbelief. The footage was gone, erased, leaving no trace of his historic achievement. He slumped back in his chair, a cold sweat breaking out on his forehead. They had gotten to the recordings. His proof was gone. But David refused to give up. He would recreate his work even if it killed him. Night after sleepless night, he toiled away in the lab, foregoing meals and rest. The equations consumed his every waking thought. His appearance grew haggard, his eyes sunken and bloodshot, his clothes hanging loosely on his thinning frame. But still he persisted, driven by a burning desire to vindicate himself and save his people. Unbeknownst to David, Kaylar's suspicions had been aroused by the human's furtive behavior. The UNA's prodigy couldn't fathom what David was up to, but he knew it couldn't be good. Kaylar cornered a maintenance worker one day and slipped him a pouch heavy with glittering cryptocurrency. "I need you to do something for me," Kaylar hissed, his eyes narrowing. "I want you to plant this camera in David Hunter's lab. Don't ask questions, just do it." The worker, his many eyes widening with fear, nodded frantically and scurried off with the device. Late one night, as David stood hunched over his workstation, the final pieces of the equation fell into place. His heart pounded with exhilaration as he scribbled down the groundbreaking formula, his hand shaking with exhaustion and anticipation. Just as he penned the last symbol, the lab door burst open with a resounding bang. David whirled around to see Kaylar striding in, flanked by a group of sneering UNA's students. Before David could react, Kaylar waved a hand lazily. The UNA student surged forward, descending upon David in a flurry of blows. Fists and tentacles slammed into his body from every angle. He crumpled to the floor, his work scattering around him. Through the haze of pain, he heard the sickening crunch of his equipment being smashed to pieces. As David lay bleeding and broken on the cold tile, Kaylar crouched down beside him, his face twisted with malicious glee. "Did you really think a primitive monkey like you could outsmart the mighty UNAs?" he sneered. "This is what happens when humans don't know their place." He awoke days later, his body a map of bruises and bandages, in the sterile confines of the medical bay. But physical pain was nothing compared to the anguish he felt when he learned of the charges being leveled against him. Academic dishonesty, stealing Kellar's work. The accusations rang in his ears, a mocking perversion of the truth. As he lay there seething with impotent rage, a cold realization crept over David. This was no simple rivalry or misunderstanding. This was a conspiracy, a concerted effort to crush him and his dreams. The rot ran deeper than he had ever imagined. But they had underestimated him. They thought they could break him, that he would slink away in defeat. They were wrong. As he stared up at the ceiling, a plan began to take shape in his mind. He would find others like him, the downtrodden and oppressed, the marginalized and mistreated. He would forge them into an alliance, a hidden network united by a common purpose, to expose the festering corruption at the heart of the Galactic Institute and to bring the truth to light, no matter the cost. As David's broken body slowly mended in the sterile confines of the medical bay, his mind raced with the chilling implications of his academic dishonesty charges. But a new, more personal horror soon eclipsed his academic woes. News reached him that his mother, Dr. Amelia Hunter, a brilliant xenobiologist, had vanished without a trace during a research expedition to the distant, unexplored world of Xenos Prime. The university officials, with thinly veiled disdain, dismissed Dr. Hunter's disappearance as a simple case of abandonment of post. They insinuated that the pressure of the expedition had been too much for her human constitution. But David knew his mother better than anyone. She was a woman of unwavering dedication, who would never abandon her life's work. No, there was something more sinister at play here, and he was determined to uncover the truth. Reaching out to his nascent network of allies, fellow outcasts and victims of the Institute's prejudice, David began to piece together a disturbing pattern. Brilliant scientists, especially those from marginalized species, had been disappearing under mysterious circumstances with alarming frequency. The official explanations were always the same: stress, instability, abandonment. But the whispers in the shadows told a different story. Driven by a burning need to find his mother and expose the rot at the heart of the Institute, David took a leave of absence from his studies. He gathered a small group of trusted companions, each with their own tales of injustice and a shared hunger for the truth. There was Zara, the brilliant Axelon engineer who had been passed over for promotion time and again in favor of less qualified Unas, and Rajit, the soft-spoken Belor telepath, who had been ostracized for refusing to use his gifts to spy for the Institute. Together, they set out to retrace Dr. Hunter's last known steps. Their first stop was a seedy spaceport bar on the outskirts of the Xenos system, where Dr. Hunter had been seen before her expedition. The bar was a warren of shadowed booths and shifty-eyed patrons, the air thick with the mingled sense of exotic liquors and desperation. David and his companions moved cautiously through the crowd, making discreet inquiries about his mother. They were met with suspicion and silence until the proprietor, a grizzled old Vaxian with a cybernetic eye, finally cracked under the weight of their persistence. I remember the human scientist," he growled, wiping a grimy glass with an even grimier rag. "She was here all right, asking a lot of questions about the ruins on Xenos Prime and the strange disappearances in the area. Didn't like the answers she was getting from the looks of it." As the team pressed for more details, David noticed a furtive figure in the shadows, watching their every move with intense interest. A chill ran down his spine as he caught a glimpse of an all-too-familiar insignia on the stranger's uniform, the crest of the Unas military. Realizing they had drawn unwanted attention, David signaled to his companions and they beat a hasty retreat from the bar. But the damage was done. They had tipped their hand, and now the hunt was on. Back on campus, Kellar paced the length of his lavish quarters, his tail lashing with barely contained rage. The news of David's meddling had reached him, and he knew he had to act quickly to contain the situation. In a darkened room, Kellar met with a group of shadowy Unas officials, their faces obscured by hooded robes. They spoke in hushed tones of the threat David posed, of how his discoveries could unravel their carefully laid plans for galactic domination. "The human must be stopped," one of the officials hissed, his voice like the rustle of dry scales. "He cannot be allowed to interfere with our work." Kellar nodded, his eyes glinting with cold determination. "I will handle David Hunter," he assured them, his voice a menacing purr. He will be neutralized, permanently, and his little band of misfits will learn the price of defiance. The officials regarded Kalar with calculating eyes. See that you do not fail, they warned. The consequences would be unpleasant. With a chilling smile, Kalar inclined his head. Failure is not an option, he said simply. As David and his team huddled in a secret safe house, planning their next move, they were unaware of the dark forces marshalling against them. Kalar, his heart filled with venomous hatred, set in motion a deadly trap that would test the limits of their resolve and the strength of their bond. The acrid stench of the toxic jungle hung heavy in the air as David and his team crept through the undergrowth, their hearts pounding with a mixture of fear and determination. The UNA's military research facility loomed ahead, a monolithic structure of gleaming metal and pulsing energy fields. Zara, her face streaked with sweat, worked frantically to bypass the complex security systems. With a final keystroke, the doors hissed open and the team slipped inside, their footsteps echoing in the eerie stillness. As they made their way deeper into the facility, the silence was broken by the low hum of machinery and the occasional distant scream. David's stomach churned with dread as they approached the central mainframe, the key to unlocking the facility's dark secrets. On the screen, grainy images flashed by, gaunt, haunted faces, scientists subjected to unspeakable experiments. And there, among them, was Dr. Amelia Hunter, her once vibrant eyes dulled by pain and despair. David's heart clenched as he read the project files, each word a fresh blow. Titan's Forge, a device designed to enslave entire worlds, to break the will of billions. And his mother, his brilliant, compassionate mother, forced to be a part of this nightmare. With trembling hands they downloaded the files, the evidence they needed to expose the UNA's vile plot. Alarms began to blare as they made their escape, the facility coming alive with shouts and pounding footsteps. Heart in his throat, David led the team through the twisting corridors, the jungle ahead their only hope of escape. As they burst from the facility, the sun seared their eyes, the toxic plants clawing at their skin. Their hidden base was a welcome respite, a chance to catch their breath and plan their next move. But even as they pored over the stolen files, a sinking realization settled over the group. They were outmatched, outgunned. The UNAs would stop at nothing to protect their secrets. The debate raged, voices rising in frustration and desperation. David opened his mouth to speak, but the words died on his lips as a deafening explosion rocked the base. Dust rained down from the ceiling as heavily armed UNA's soldiers poured in, led by a familiar, hated face. Kalar, his eyes burning with malice, fixed his gaze on David. "Did you really think you could hide from me?" he snarled, his voice dripping with contempt. Chaos erupted, energy blasts scorching the air. In the confusion, David found himself cut off from his friends, alone and vulnerable. With Kellar's taunting laughter ringing in his ears, he fled into the jungle, his lungs burning, his mind reeling. The undergrowth tore at his skin as he ran, Kellar's footsteps growing ever closer. Stumbling into a hidden cave, David collapsed, his chest heaving with exhaustion and fear. David's mind raced, torn between terror and a strange, inexplicable pull. Kellar's footsteps echoed at the cave's mouth, a death knell. With a final desperate lunge, David reached out, his fingers brushing the artifact's cool surface. Light exploded around him, blinding, all-consuming. David felt himself falling, hurtling through an infinite void. And then, as suddenly as it began, the light faded, and he found himself somewhere else entirely. An ethereal realm stretched out before him, a place beyond the confines of space and time. And there, waiting for him, were beings of pure energy, their forms shifting and shimmering. "David Hunter," they spoke, their voices resonating in his mind. "We have watched your struggles, witnessed the bravery in your heart. You alone can stop the UNAs, can save your world and countless others." With a final solemn nod, the beings faded, leaving David alone once more. But he was not the same man who had entered the cave. He was a champion, a beacon of hope in a galaxy consumed by darkness. Squaring his shoulders, David turned to face the entrance, ready to confront his destiny. Kalar stood there, his face twisted with rage and disbelief. "What have you done?" the Unas roared, raising his weapon. David emerged from the cave, his body thrumming with ancient power. A psionic aura shimmered around him, pulsing in time with his heartbeat. As he stepped into the harsh sunlight, he found Kalar and a squad of heavily armed Unas soldiers waiting for him, their weapons trained on his chest. Kalar's face twisted into a mask of rage. "You think you can hide from me, human?" he snarled, his finger tightening on the trigger. David said nothing. He simply raised his hand and a blast of psionic energy erupted from his palm. The soldiers were thrown backward, their weapons clattering to the ground as they tumbled through the air like rag dolls. Kalar let out a roar of fury and charged at David, a plasma blade crackling to life in his hand. David stood his ground, a shimmering force field materializing around him, just as Kalar's blade came slashing down. The plasma blade rebounded off the force field with a crackling hiss, sending Kalar staggering back. They circled each other, Kalar's eyes burning with hatred, David's glowing with newfound power. Kalar lunged again, his blade a blur of searing light, but David parried each blow with ease, his force field absorbing the impacts. "Where is my mother?" he demanded, his voice echoing with psionic resonance. Kalar glared up at him, defiance warring with fear in his eyes. But as David's power pressed down on his mind, he finally broke. The research station," he gasped. "On the moon of Zephyrus Prime." David nodded, then reached out with his mind, triggering the emergency beacon on Kalar's belt. "The authorities will be here soon," he said coldly. "I'm sure they'll be very interested in what you have to say." Leaving Kalar and his soldiers groaning on the ground, David reached out with his thoughts, calling his team to him. They emerged from the jungle, their eyes widening as they took in the scene of carnage. "David," Zara breathed, her voice a mix of awe and fear. "What happened to you?" David looked at his hands, still glowing with psionic energy. "I've been given a gift," he said softly, "a chance to save my mother and the galaxy." He met their eyes, his gaze intense. "But I can't do it alone. Will you stand with me?" One by one they nodded, their expressions hardening with determination. Together they set off into the jungle, heading for the hidden spaceport where their ship was docked. As they flew through the void of space, David pored over the stolen schematics of the research station, his mind racing. The facility was a fortress, bristling with defenses both physical and psionic, but there was a weakness, a network of underground tunnels used for waste disposal. They landed in a sheltered crater, a few clicks from the station, the ship's cloaking device shimmering into place. Armed with psionic shields and energy weapons, they made their way to the tunnel entrance, a rusted grate set into the side of a rocky outcropping. The tunnels were dark and dank, the air thick with the stench of decay. Strange, twisted creatures skittered in the shadows, the products of the Una's failed experiments. David and his team pressed on, their lights cutting through the gloom, their hearts pounding in their chests. As they emerged into the lower levels of the station, they found themselves in a nightmarish labyrinth of halls and chambers. Grotesque abominations floated in tanks of viscous fluid, their bodies warped by the Una's attempts at mind control. Mutated creatures prowled the corridors, their eyes glowing with feral hunger. Fighting through the horrors, they finally reached the heart of the facility, the chamber housing the Titan's forge. And there, wired into the machine like a living battery, was David's mother. Her once vibrant face was gaunt and pale, her eyes staring blankly ahead. David's heart clenched at the sight of her, a wave of grief and rage washing over him. Reaching out with his mind, he delved into her consciousness, a landscape of fractured thoughts and twisted nightmares. He saw her deepest fears and regrets played out in vivid detail, manifestations of the Titan's forge's insidious programming. David fought through the mental landscape, battling against the manifestations with blasts of psionic energy. But just as he was about to reach the core of his mother's being, a dark presence loomed before him. It was a manifestation of the Una's collective will, a monstrous entity of pure psionic power. It lashed out at David, its tendrils of dark energy whipping through the mindscape. David stood his ground, drawing on every ounce of his newfound power. He could feel the entity pressing against his mind, trying to crush his will. But he pushed back, his psionic energy blazing like a supernova. The two forces clashed in a titanic battle of wills, the mindscape shuddering around them. David gritted his teeth, pouring all of his strength into the fight. He knew that if he failed, not only would his mother be lost forever, but the Unas would use the Titan's forge to enslave the galaxy. With a final desperate surge of power, David shattered the entity's hold, sending it reeling back into the depths of the mindscape. Exhausted but triumphant, he reached out to his mother's consciousness, gently guiding her back to the light. In the physical world, alarms blared and warning lights flashed as the Titan's forge began to overload, unable to handle the psionic feedback. David's team worked frantically to disconnect his mother from the machine, supporting her weakened body as they made their escape. They burst out of the facility just as it went critical, a massive explosion reducing the hated place to rubble. As the dust settled, David cradled his mother in his arms, tears streaking his face. David nodded, a sob catching in his throat. "It's me, Mom. You're safe now. It's over." But even as they embraced, David knew that this was only the beginning. The Unas would not take this defeat lightly. They would come for him, for his mother, for everyone he cared about. But he was ready for them. With his team by his side and the power of the ancients coursing through his veins, he would take the fight to the Unas. He would free the enslaved worlds, unite the oppressed peoples of the galaxy, and bring an end to the Unas' tyranny once and for all. The road ahead was dark and perilous, but David had never been more certain of his purpose. He was the champion of the ancient ones, the savior of the galaxy, and he would not rest until the light of freedom shone on every world. David plunged into the twisted landscape of his mother's mind, a realm warped by the insidious influence of the Titan's forge. The air crackled with malevolent energy as the dark presence, a manifestation of the Una's collective will, loomed before him like a towering colossus of shadow and malice. The entity lashed out with a barrage of psychic assaults, each one a searing lance of agony that threatened to shatter David's sanity. Visions of his deepest fears and darkest secrets flashed before his eyes, twisted and amplified by the Una's sadistic manipulation. But David, his mind fortified by the ancient wisdom granted to him, stood firm against the onslaught. He countered with a brilliant display of mental fortitude, erecting shimmering barriers of thought that deflected the worst of the psychic barrage. As the battle raged on, the landscape around them shifted and warped, reflecting the titanic struggle of wills. Jagged spires of obsidian erupted from the ground, only to crumble moments later under the onslaught of David's defiance. Through the chaos, David began to perceive the true nature of the Titan's forge. It was not merely a tool of mind control, but a conduit through which the Unas drained the knowledge and experiences of their victims, growing stronger with each stolen memory. A sudden flash of insight struck David like a thunderbolt. If he could overload the system with his own memories and emotions, he might be able to create a feedback loop that would shatter the Una's control and free the enslaved minds. With a determined set to his jaw, David delved deep into his own psyche, dredging up every memory, every emotion, every scrap of his identity. He poured them into the mindscape, a raging torrent of human experience that slammed into the dark presence with the force of a supernova. The entity reeled under the assault, its form fracturing as it was bombarded by a lifetime of love, loss, triumph, and despair. The mindscape began to crumble around them, the once imposing structures reduced to rubble by the sheer power of David's onslaught. But the dark presence, though weakened, refused to yield. It rallied, drawing upon the combined might of the Unas to launch a final, desperate attack. David, his strength waning, his mind stretched to the breaking point, staggered under the blow. Just as all seemed lost, a flicker of light caught David's eye. There, in the depths of his mother's consciousness, a single fragile thread of her true self remained, fighting against the Una's control. With a final desperate surge of power, David reached out and grasped the thread, pouring every last ounce of his strength into one last pull. The thread held, and then, with a blinding flash of light, it began to unravel, the Una's control over his mother's mind disintegrating like a house of cards in a hurricane. In the next instant, David found himself back in the physical world, his mother's limp form cradled in his arms. Around them, the other captive scientists began to stir, their eyes clear for the first time in years, as the Titan's forge lay in ruins, its power broken. But even as relief washed over him, David felt a cold sense of dread settle in the pit of his stomach. The Unas would not let this defeat go unanswered. They would come for him, for his mother, for all of them. With a heavy heart, David helped his mother to her feet, supporting her as they made their way out of the shattered remnants of the facility. The other survivors fell in behind them, a ragtag band of haunted souls united by their ordeal. But he also knew that he was no longer alone. He had his mother, his friends, and the knowledge that there were others out there like him, fighting against the Unas' tyranny. Together, they would find a way to stop the Unas, to free the enslaved worlds and bring hope to a galaxy too long shrouded in darkness. The road ahead would be long and treacherous, but David was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. In the smouldering ruins of the research station, David and his team gathered the survivors, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and trepidation. The weight of their discovery hung heavy in the air as they huddled together, their voices low and urgent. "We can't let the Unas get away with this," Zara hissed, her eyes flashing with anger. "The galaxy needs to know the truth." David nodded, his jaw set. "We'll spread the word to every rebel faction, every whistleblower who'll listen. The Unas' reign of terror ends now." They worked tirelessly, reaching out to contacts across the stars, sharing the damning evidence they had uncovered. Grainy, hollow footage of the twisted experiments, the haunted faces of the captive scientists, the schematics of the Titan's forge. All of it was carefully disseminated, a clarion call to arms against the Unas' tyranny. But as the days turned to weeks, a sense of unease began to grow. The responses they had hoped for, the groundswell of outrage and solidarity, failed to materialize. Instead, they were met with hesitation, skepticism, and even outright fear. "So you don't understand," a grizzled rebel leader said, his hologram flickering. "The Unas are too powerful. If we stand against them, they'll crush us like insects." David slammed his fist on the table, frustration boiling over. "So we just let them get away with it? Let them enslave and torture innocent people?" The rebel leader shook his head sadly. "I'm sorry, but we can't afford to take that risk. We're not ready for a war with the Unas. Not yet." As the rejections piled up, David's resolve only hardened. He knew what he had to do, even if it meant putting himself in the crosshairs of the most powerful empire in the galaxy. "I'm going to broadcast our story to the Galactic Council," he announced to his team, his voice steely. "I'll show them the truth, even if it means painting a target on my back." His mother, still weak from her ordeal, placed a hand on his arm. "David, are you sure about this? The Unas will stop at nothing to silence you." As he prepared for his moment of truth, strange occurrences began to plague David and his team. Shadowy figures seemed to follow them, always just out of sight. Eerie whispers echoed in the darkness, hinting at an even deeper conspiracy lurking beneath the surface. David's nerves frayed, his sleep haunted by visions of an ancient, unspeakable evil. He began to question his own sanity, wondering if the weight of his responsibilities was finally taking its toll. On the eve of his broadcast, as David paced his quarters, a hooded figure materialized from the shadows. David whirled, his heart pounding, his hand instinctively reaching for his weapon. "Be at ease, David Hunter," the figure said, its voice a rasping whisper. "I come bearing a warning. David eyed the stranger warily. "Who are you? What do you want?" The figure lowered its hood, revealing a face that seemed to shift and change with each passing moment. "I am a messenger, a herald of truths long hidden, and I have come to tell you that the path you walk is fraught with peril." David's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" The figure stepped closer, its eyes glinting in the dim light. "The ancient ones who granted you your powers, they have their own agenda. They have been manipulating events from the very beginning, guiding you towards a fate that serves their own ends." A chill ran down David's spine. "What do you mean? What ends?" The figure's voice dropped to a whisper. "By exposing the Unas, you may be playing right into their hands. The true threat to the galaxy is far more ancient and insidious than you can imagine. The Unas are but pawns in a game that has been played out across the eons." The figure began to fade, its form dissolving into the shadows. "Belief is your choice, David Hunter, but know that the path ahead is shrouded in darkness, and the choices you make will echo across the stars. Tread carefully, for the fate of billions hangs in the balance." The next day, as he stood before the cameras preparing to address the Galactic Council, David felt the weight of the galaxy pressing down upon him. He took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves, trying to push aside the doubts that gnawed at his soul. The council chamber fell silent, every eye fixed upon him. David looked out at the sea of faces, some curious, some skeptical, some openly hostile. He knew that his next words would set in motion a chain of events that could not be undone, that could reshape the very fabric of the galaxy. And as he opened his mouth to speak, a chill ran down his spine, a sense of standing on the edge of an abyss, staring into the heart of an ancient and unspeakable darkness. With trembling hands, David stood before the Galactic Council, the weight of his revelations pressing down upon him. As he recounted the horrors he had witnessed, the atrocities the Unas had committed, a wave of murmurs swept through the chamber. Disbelief, outrage, and a growing sense of unease rippled through the gathered delegates. But as the tide seemed to turn in David's favor, a sudden explosion ripped through the council hall. The ground heaved beneath his feet, throwing him off balance. Screams echoed through the chamber as debris rained down from the shattered ceiling. Through the billowing smoke and dust, David glimpsed a terrifying sight. Una's soldiers, armed to the teeth, stormed into the chamber, their eyes glinting with malice. And at their head, a figure he had hoped never to see again. Kellar, his face twisted with triumphant rage. Chaos erupted as delegates fled in panic, desperately seeking escape. David's allies rallied around him, their faces grim with determination. Energy blasts seared the air as they fought their way through the advancing Unas, the stench of ozone and burning flesh filling their nostrils. David's heart pounded in his chest as they raced through the collapsing corridors, the sounds of pursuit echoing behind them. They burst out of the council hall, stumbling into the harsh light of the galactic capital's streets, just as the once grand structure crumbled into rubble. Desperate and hunted, they fled into the city's seedy underbelly, seeking refuge in the shadows. The neon-lit alleys and grimy back streets seemed to close in around them, the eyes of the downtrodden and the desperate following their every move. It was there in a dimly lit safehouse that they encountered the rebels. Hard-bitten and battle-scarred, these warriors claimed to have been fighting the Una's influence for decades, waging a secret war in the galaxy's darkest corners. As David and his companions shared their tale, the rebels listened with growing unease. When David mentioned the ancient aliens and the powers they had granted him, a ripple of recognition passed through the group. The rebel leader, a grizzled Vaxian with cybernetic implants, leaned forward, his voice low and urgent. "The beings you speak of, the ones who gave you your abilities, they are known to us. We call them the Voidbringers." David's blood ran cold as the rebel continued. "They are a primordial race, older than the stars themselves. They seek to manipulate younger species, to use them as pawns in their cosmic games. And you, David Hunter, may have unwittingly become their greatest instrument." The rebel's words echoed in David's mind, a growing sense of horror settling in his gut. The powers he had relied on, the abilities that had saved him and his friends, could they truly be a double-edged sword? By using them, was he inadvertently strengthening the Voidbringer's grip on the galaxy? As David grappled with this revelation, a new threat emerged. The Unas, enraged by his escape and the exposure of their crimes, had branded him a traitor. Now, they would stop at nothing to hunt him down, to silence him and his allies forever. With a heavy heart, David and his team prepared to flee once more. But this time their goal was not just survival. They had to unravel the mystery of the Voidbringers, to understand the true nature of the powers that coursed through David's veins. Their journey would take them to the farthest reaches of the galaxy, to ancient ruins and forgotten worlds that held the key to unlocking the secrets of the past. But as they ventured deeper into the unknown, a chilling realization began to dawn on them. The greatest threat they faced may not be the Unas, or even the Voidbringers themselves. It may be the darkness that lurked within their own hearts, the whispers of temptation and power that threatened to consume them from within. David and his companions ventured deeper into the crumbling ruins, their footsteps echoing through the eerie silence. The air grew thick with an oppressive sense of dread, as if the very walls were watching their every move. Zara, her face drawn and pale, murmured, "Something's not right here. It feels like the ruins are alive somehow." As they pressed on, the whispers began, sibilant, insidious, slithering into their minds like icy tendrils. Fragments of alien thoughts and emotions assailed them, growing more intense and disturbing with each step. Rajit, his eyes wide with terror, clutched at his head, his breath coming in ragged gasps. In a desperate gambit, they split up, each taking a different path into the heart of the ruins. David, his heart pounding, followed a twisting corridor that seemed to breathe and pulse around him. The whispers grew to a deafening crescendo, a cacophony of alien voices that threatened to shatter his sanity. Suddenly a scream tore through the air, primal and filled with agony. David whirled around, his blood running cold. That scream. It had been Zara's voice, but twisted and distorted beyond recognition. He raced through the ruins, following the echoes of the scream, his mind filled with horrifying visions of what he might find. He burst into a cavernous chamber, and the sight that greeted him froze the breath in his lungs. Zara, or what had once been Zara, stood before him, her body warped and twisted into a grotesque parody of her former self. Her skin had taken on a sickly, mottled hue, and her limbs had elongated into spindly insectoid appendages. Her face, once so beautiful, was now a leering mask of alien hunger, her eyes black pits that seemed to devour the light. The creature that had been his friend let out a shrill, inhuman shriek and lunged at him, its claws outstretched. David, his heart breaking, dodged the blow and fled deeper into the ruins, the creature's shrieks echoing behind him. As he ran, he stumbled upon Rajit, his form similarly twisted and deformed. The once gentle telepath now radiated a malevolent aura, his eyes glowing with an otherworldly light. David, tears streaming down his face, turned and ran, his friend's monstrous forms shambling after him. Alone, haunted by the screams of his companions, David staggered into the heart of the ruins, a vast circular chamber pulsing with an eerie, sickly light. In the center, hovering above a raised dais, was an ancient artifact, its surface covered in alien glyphs that seemed to writhe and shimmer before his eyes. As if in a trance, David approached the artifact, his hand outstretched. The moment his fingers brushed its surface, a blinding flash of light exploded through his mind, and he found himself elsewhere, adrift in a vast, incomprehensible void. Before him, stretching into infinity, was a being of impossible scale and horror, the true form of the Voidbringers. It was a vast, pulsating mass of writhing tentacles and gnashing maws, a nightmare made manifest, and in that moment, David understood the terrible truth. The Voidbringers were not merely an ancient race, but a cosmic horror beyond comprehension, feeding on the psychic energy of countless civilizations, steering them toward conflict and destruction to fuel their own twisted existence. Overwhelmed by the revelation, David wrenched himself back to reality. his mind reeling. He knew now what he had to do. He had to escape these accursed ruins and warn the galaxy of the coming darkness before it was too late. But as he turned to flee, he found himself face to face with the twisted remnants of his own team, their once familiar faces now leering alien visages. Zara, Rajit, even his own mother, all of them now fully under the thrall of the Voidbringers. With a heavy heart and tears in his eyes, David raised his weapon, knowing that the fate of the galaxy hung in the balance. He had to fight, even if it meant confronting the monsters that had once been his closest friends and allies. The battle was joined, a desperate, heart-wrenching struggle in the heart of the ancient ruins. David's weapon flashed and sizzled, tears blurring his vision as he fought against the twisted abominations that wore the faces of his loved ones. Zara, her once graceful movements now jerky and unnatural, lashed out with razor-sharp claws, her shrieks echoing through the chamber. David, his heart breaking with each blow, dodged and weaved, his weapon finding its mark again and again. And his mother, her body warped and twisted by the Voidbringer's influence, lunged at him with inhuman strength, her face a leering mockery of the woman he had once known. David, tears streaming down his face, met her blow for blow, his heart shattering with each impact. The battle raged on, a desperate, gut-wrenching struggle against the unthinkable. David's body ached with exhaustion, his mind battered by the horrors he had witnessed. But still, he fought on, driven by a grim determination to survive, to escape, to warn the galaxy of the coming darkness. In a final desperate push, David unleashed a searing blast of energy from his weapon, the air crackling with the intensity of the discharge. The twisted abominations that had once been his friends and family reeled back, their forms crumbling and dissolving under the onslaught. Seizing his chance, David turned and fled, his heart pounding, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He raced through the twisting corridors of the ruins, the echoes of the battle still ringing in his ears. At last he burst out into the harsh light of the alien sun, his eyes watering, his lungs burning. Behind him the ruins loomed, a dark, menacing presence that seemed to pulse with malevolent energy. But David knew he could not rest, could not stop. The galaxy needed to be warned, the truth needed to be told. With a heavy heart and a grim resolve, he set out across the barren, alien landscape, his mind already racing with the challenges that lay ahead. David stumbled out of the crumbling ruins, his body aching, his mind reeling from the horrors he had witnessed. The weight of his grim discovery pressed down on him, threatening to crush his very soul. He knew he had to warn the galaxy of the impending doom, that he might be the only one who could stop the Voidbringer's insidious plan. As he raced back to his ship, the faces of his fallen friends flashed before his eyes. Zara's twisted visage, Rajit's monstrous form, his mother's haunted eyes, they were etched into his mind, a constant reminder of the nightmarish depths to which the ruins had dragged them. The journey back to the galactic capital was a blur of hyperspace jumps and restless sleep, plagued by visions of the writhing abominations that had once been his closest allies. When he finally arrived, David found himself standing before the Galactic Council, his heart pounding, his palms slick with sweat. The councillors regarded him with a mixture of skepticism and thinly veiled contempt. To them he was just another human, a primitive upstart meddling in matters far beyond his comprehension. But David knew he had to make them understand, to force them to confront the truth no matter how terrifying it might be. Closing his eyes, David reached out with his newfound psychic powers, his mind brushing against the consciousness of every councillor in the room. With a surge of mental energy, he projected his memories directly into their minds, bombarding them with the same nightmarish visions that had haunted his every waking moment. The councillors reeled back in their seats, their eyes widening in horror as they witnessed the twisted abominations, the cosmic scale of the Voidbringer's malevolence. Some screamed, others wept, and a few simply stared in numb shock, their minds struggling to process the sheer enormity of the threat they faced. When the visions finally faded, the council chamber was silent, save for the ragged breathing of the traumatized councillors. They looked at David with new eyes, their faces etched with a dawning realization of the gravity of the situation. In the days that followed, the Council mobilized its forces, reaching out to every corner of the galaxy to rally the disparate races against the coming darkness. Ships were armed, soldiers were trained, and ancient alliances were reforged in the face of the common threat. But even as the preparations began, David could feel a change within himself. The powers that had once been a gift now felt like a curse, twisting and warping his body and mind in subtle, insidious ways. He caught glimpses of himself in mirrors and polished surfaces, his reflection distorted and alien, his eyes glinting with an otherworldly malevolence. With growing horror, David realized that the Voidbringer's influence was slowly corrupting him from within, using him as a conduit to spread their malign presence across the galaxy. He had become a liability, a ticking time bomb that could unleash untold destruction upon the very people he had fought so hard to protect. In a moment of brutal clarity, David knew what he had to do. He sought out the rebel leader in a clandestine meeting, pressing a data drive into the grizzled warrior's hand. On it was all the information he had gathered on the Voidbringers, as well as his own research into the FTL technology that had started him on this path so long ago. "You have to continue the fight," David said, his voice tight with emotion. "Rally the races of the galaxy. Find a way to stop the Voidbringers, no matter the cost." The rebel leader nodded, his eyes hard with determination. "And what about you?" With a final, crushing embrace, David turned and walked away, his heart heavy with the weight of his decision. In the depths of the spaceport, he found a small, nondescript spacecraft, its hull scarred and pitted from countless journeys. As he settled into the pilot's seat, David's hands shook on the controls. He knew he was setting out on a journey from which there could be no return, a self-imposed exile to protect the galaxy from the darkness that now lurked within him. The ship rose from the spaceport, its engines flaring against the night sky. David watched as the lights of the galactic capital receded behind him, a glittering jewel in the darkness of space. As he drifted away into the void, David's mind began to fracture, the alien presence within him growing stronger with each passing moment. He clung to the last vestiges of his humanity, his eyes fixed on the stars he had once dreamed of exploring. A single tear rolled down his cheek, a final silent prayer for the galaxy he left behind. He prayed that his sacrifice would not be in vain, that someday the races of the galaxy would find a way to vanquish the darkness and restore the light. With a final, shuddering breath, David closed his eyes, his body and mind finally consumed by the Voidbringer's insidious presence. As his ship disappeared into the depths of space, the galaxy was left to face the impending storm, united in their resolve to fight against the encroaching shadows. But even as they marshaled their forces and steeled their hearts for the battles to come, they would forever be haunted by the memory of the young human who had sacrificed everything to give them a chance at survival. The human who had stared into the abyss and willingly surrendered himself to its depths, all for the sake of the galaxy he loved. You have reached the end of the story. If you enjoyed this story and want to support us, please leave a like and subscribe to our channel, and for every comment that says 88, I will heart every single one of them. Thank you for your time.